I'll call this meeting to order. It's the regularly scheduled meeting of the Transportation and Public Works Committee this day, June 11th, 2019. I'm Councilman Reich. I chair the committee, and I'm joined by my colleagues, Councilmembers Johnson, Fletcher, and Gordon. We are a quorum, and we will proceed with today's agenda, which has 18 items. We have discussion, public hearings, and consent. I'll go through consent. Any committee member can pull them for further deliberation at their will. Item 3 on consent is the Northern Spark Large Block Event Permit from June 14th to 15th. Item 4 is the Stone Arch Bridge Festival Large Block Event from June 15th to 16th. Item 5 is the Rock the Garden Large Block Event from June 29th. Item 6 is the snow and ice removal from Public Sidewalks Assessment, setting public hearing, and that public hearing set for July 16th. Item 7 is the Sidewalk Repair Construction Assessment, setting that public hearing, which is for July 30th. Item 8 is the Minneapolis Stormwater Management Program and Annual Report, setting the public hearing for July 16th. 9 is the agreement with the Mississippi Watershed Management Organization for the Minneapolis Park and Recreation Board design of a storm sewer system and stormwater pond at the Columbia Golf Course. Item 10 is the contract amendment with CDM Smith for Fridley Campus Industrial Electrical Rehabilitation Project. Item 11 is the contract amendment with AE2S Construction for additional services at Pump Station 7 Outdoor Construction Project. Item 12 is the contract amendment with James Corner Field Operations for Nicollet Mall Reconstruction Project. Item 13 is the contract amendment with Meyer Contracting for the Nicollet Mall Reconstruction Project. 14 is the contract with Kimley Horn & Associates for engineering design services for the Grand Avenue South Street Reconstruction Project. 15 is the access easement agreement with Metro Green Line Extension for the Southwest LR Light Rail Project. Item 16 is the Bicycle Advisory Committee revisions. Item 17 is the Pedestrian Committee appointments. Those people are listed. And those are the consent items that anyone wish to pull them for consideration. Councilmember Fletcher.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't need to pull anything for discussion, but I do just want to make a brief comment that we are once again voting on event permits that will have, for events that will have already happened by the time this gets to council. And I've sort of made light of this in the past, but I'm not feeling like making light of it at this point. I think we're getting to a point where we need an opportunity to respond to some of these plans. I love all the events that are happening. They're mostly happening in my ward, and they're great. And sometimes the way they end up getting blocked out, we've ended up taking sidewalks and bike lanes that we don't need to be taking as a part of the way we fence things off or the way we design these. And we actually need a little bit of an opportunity to respond to these permits in a way that could actually impact the event. So I just want to note my concern about the timing for the way these are coming through, and I'm hoping that we can have a little more of an opportunity to intervene as these events are getting approved. But that said, I'm happy to let these through. I plan to attend both of them, and I think they're going to be great.
Thank you for those comments. I think your point's well taken. It's not much of a review process if there's no process in which we actually review something. So, point well taken. Any other discussion on the items in consent? Seeing none, I'll move all items. All in favor say aye. Aye. Dissenting name. Those items carry with the comments noted by Councilmember Fletcher. Item number 1 on the agenda is a public hearing. Good morning, Director Hutchinson.
Good morning, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. Thank you, Councilmember Fletcher, for your comments. I agree, and we'll work harder to bring these forward sooner, working with our partners who we can bring along hopefully a little bit faster. On to this public hearing agenda item number 1. This is our 2019 alley renovation program. We have just a couple of ways we can address our alleys. This is specifically for alley renovation. This is the project approval and assessment. Additional information is going to be presented by Mike Kennedy, the Director of Transportation Maintenance and Repair.
Good morning, Mr. Kennedy, and I'll note that we're joined by Councilmember Palmisano.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Again, Mike Kennedy. I'm the Director of Transportation Maintenance and Repair for Minneapolis Public Works. We're here for the 2019 Alley Renovation Program. To extend the operational life of the concrete alleys and to facilitate localized drainage, the Department of Public Works recommends that concrete alleys be overlaid with asphalt. If an alley has been previously resurfaced, the old bituminous material will be removed down to the original concrete before the new surface is placed. Public Works recommends this year that 7 alleys located throughout the city be resurfaced. The project cost estimate for this work is $197,500. The 2019 adopted uniform assessment rate will be used for the portion of the project cost being assessed, conforming to the current city policy of using uniform assessment rates for street construction, renovation, and resurfacing. The alley renovation uniform assessment rate for this year is 7 cents per square foot of land area abutting the alley to be improved. The rate's the same for residential and non-residential use properties, and the proposed alley renovation special assessments were determined using a formula that combines the benefited land area with an annually established uniform assessment rate. This formula is carefully considered and applied by city staff and is intended to reflect for each property or each project's value to the benefited properties. The remaining costs not covered by assessments will be funded by net debt bonds. So today, it's our recommendation that we pass a resolution ordering the work to proceed and adopting special assessments in the amount of $68,475.24 for this year's program, and passage of a resolution requesting the Board of Estimate Taxation to authorize the city's issuance and sale of assessment bonds in said amount for the program this year. And that's my presentation for the moment, and we can take questions if any.
Thank you. Any questions per the staff presentation? Seeing none, I will open the public hearing. Anyone signed in? Anyone wish to come forward and give testimony? Anyone wish to come forward? For item number 1, seeing none, I will close the public hearing and move the item as submitted by staff. Any further discussion? See none, all in favor say aye. Aye. Dissenting nay. That carries, and we can now go to item number 2.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. Item number 2 is the renewal of the West Broadway Improvement Special Service District. This is going to be presented by Andy Carlson, who manages all of our special service districts. And as a short reminder, this is one of 2 self-managed special service districts in the city.
Thank you. Good morning.
Good morning, Chairman Reich and Council Member. My name is Andrew Carlson. I'm the project manager for Special Service Districts. Today we are seeking to re-adopt the ordinance to renew the West Broadway Improvement Special Service District for an additional 5 years. By way of a little background, the Minneapolis Code of Ordinances, Chapter 434, establishing the district, included a sunset provision stipulating that the ordinance would expire at the end of the district's 5th year, which would be the end of 2019. Unless the ordinance is renewed by following the standards and procedures set forth in Minnesota Statute 428A. In accordance with this provision, petitions from property owners within the district requesting renewal of the district's ordinance sufficient to satisfy the requirements described in statute have been submitted to the city. We have received a letter from the city attorney's office certifying that the property owners comply with the requirements of Minnesota statute. The petition requirements were the same as were set forth when the district was created back in 2014. A motion to introduce the subject matter of amending Minneapolis Code of Ordinances, Chapter 434, to re-adopt the ordinance to renew the district was introduced at the City Council on April 19th for its first reading and referred to the Transportation and Public Works Committee. In addition to readopting the ordinance is proposed to amend establishing a new provision for the sunset provision of December 31st, 2024. Notice of the public hearing was published in the official newspaper of the city on May 18th and June 4th. A notice of public hearing was also mailed on May 23rd to all property owners proposed to be subject to the district service charges. Pursuant to Minnesota Statute 428A, additional procedures will be required upon adoption of the ordinance. It is therefore recommended that the City Council amend Minneapolis Code of Ordinances, Chapter 434, to re-adopt the ordinance and renew the West Broadway Improvement Special Service District with a proposed new sunset date of December 31st, 2024, unless the ordinance has been renewed. That completes my remarks. We do have some members from the public to speak in favor of the district, but if there's any questions for me, I will stand for questions.
Good. We have a moment for questions for staff per the presentation. See none, we can proceed now to the public hearing. Folks are signed in. No one signed in, but there are people ready to speak. So please come forward, state your name and address for the record.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, fellow committee council members. My name is Dean Rose. I am a property owner and business owner on West Broadway Avenue, Broadway Flats, and Broadway Liquor Outlet. I also serve on the board of directors of the West Broadway Coalition for the past couple of decades. I'm here today to ask for your support in renewing our West Broadway Improvement District boundaries and ordinance again. I think over the past 5 years, we have seen many positive benefits from this improvement district that is all self-managed by our organization. First and foremost, the thousands of pounds of trash that we eliminate every year off of the streets, I think, is one of the most important benefits of this organization. The holiday lighting that we put up adds a festive tone to our avenue. The public displays of art and public benches and trash cans that we monitor and maintain annually, as well as the collaboration of public and private partnerships, I think, has served our area very well over the past 5 years. And I ask for your continued support for another 5 years. Thank you very much.
Thank you for those comments. Anyone else wish to come forward and make comment? Anyone wish to come forward? Seeing none, we'll close the public hearing. And I will comment that this has just been, I think, one of the great success stories of the whole system. The community has stepped up. They've taken ownership in a very literal sense, and the results, as testified today, are spectacular. And I think Mr. Carlson has commented likewise with his experience and professional opinion that this is a great success story in partnership. So with that, I'll take any commentary from the committee. See none, I'll move the item as presented. All in favor say aye. Aye. Dissenting nay. That carries. Thank you. We can now go to the final item on our agenda, which is a discussion item number 18. Director Hutchinson.
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, this report that you are about to receive is the after analysis of the city's pilot program to proactively inspect sidewalks that have, on a somewhat random basis, as will be explained, and we felt it was very important to use as much data as possible to understand the success of the pilot and for that data to steer us towards all of our next steps in the area of snow removal on city sidewalks. Lisa Cerny is our city engineer and deputy director, and because this was a very multi-divisional effort across several divisions, Lisa will be presenting information to you today.
Good morning.
Good morning, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. My name is Lisa Cerny. I'm the City Engineer, Deputy Director of Public Works, and I'm here to provide you with an update on our snow and ice report for sidewalks. So this morning I am going to review some of the background, briefly share information about our outreach and the many different conversations that we had over this past winter season, provide specific information related to our proactive sidewalk pilot, as well as the data and next steps. So a little bit of background before I get into where we are today. So going back to 2017, we started making some changes and really focusing on what can we do to speed up the timeline of the process that we have today in order to increase sidewalk compliance. So part of that change or that improvement really was about as soon as a complaint came in, we would issue a notice of violation. That reduced the amount of time. It increased the response, but it got us to connect with those properties that weren't compliant more quickly. I'll come back to that in a second, but so we started back in 2017. In 2018, we completed the pedestrian and bicycle winter maintenance study. We've been back and shared a variety of different updates on that. In addition, we worked very closely with the audit department and 311 in order to review the process, review the data, and really help us. Over time, we were starting to hear from folks about maybe the accuracy, or, well, we had cleared our sidewalk and we got a notice, what happened? And so that audit process recently was completed, and we identified some challenges, I guess I'll say, with that around data accuracy. Don't have all the answers, don't have all of the next steps associated with that, but we are going to continue to work with them and 311 and IT in order to make sure that we are communicating with the appropriate property owners that are in violation. And so that'll be just an ongoing portion of our work. So education was one of the key activities to what we identified in the winter maintenance study. And we took a variety of different approaches with a lot of different internal and external partners. Last November, a citywide letter was sent from Director Hutchison. We felt it was really important to maybe reframe the reason why clearing sidewalks is so important, make sure that people understood what they were responsible for, and if they weren't doing it, what would happen. And we also know there's a number of people out there that are not able to clear the sidewalks themselves, and so we wanted to be able to connect them with resources that are available to help them do that. As we rolled through the season, we had over 70 media requests. The media was one of our external partners that really helped get information out there, let people know that we were focusing on this, let people know that it really is a priority for the city and everyone to have clear sidewalks in order to keep people moving around the city. A variety of other activities that we did. We worked with NCR, and we had a number of multicultural radio conversations throughout the winter, which helped us connect to people in other ways that we hadn't necessarily leveraged in the past, as well as social media, website, and kind of the typical communication tools. So in addition to inspections, I just want to be really clear that we continued to do our reactive work like we had in years past. So when people observed noncompliance, they could still call 311. We still responded. We still followed up with that process. What I'm going to focus on today is really our proactive pilot inspection. So a little bit about the methodology. We divided the city into 4 quadrants, which you can see on the map attached. We called those quadrants A, B, C, and D. The quadrants were already existed as part of a national system created for multi-agency use. The quadrants that we created within that grid pattern, we followed primarily freeways, the river, kind of some major types of boundaries. You'll see that they're not equal, and we approached them from a way to try to get a representation of the data across the city. The grids that you see highlighted on this map are the grids that were randomly selected. So we used a random number generator to select the grids to go out and collect this data. Staff were able to inspect over 35,000 properties of the roughly 130,000 properties in the city of Minneapolis. Through the process, one of the things we valued was there were 4 grids that were randomly selected twice. We have 2 data from more than one event in one area. It's valuable as you're digging into that, and I'll share the results later. So just a little bit about the process. So we blended the proactive process into the reactive process. We didn't want to recreate the wheel. But what we did do is have good, solid data when we were starting, and this is where it's the location and accuracy we're confident in as compared to the reactive piece. So the rectangle that you see in the process is really the piece that we added, coming up with the grid and the methodology, training staff Like Director Hutchison said, this is a multi-department effort. We prioritized this work, and we had a great team that came together, and I think really the feedback we heard from them was enjoyed doing something a little bit different, enjoyed being able to work on something that is so valued by residents as well as the department and yourselves. So, so with these inspections, then we were able to go out in the field, collect data, and we're now able to use that data to review and analyze. The piece that didn't change was the sending of the notice of violation, if sidewalks aren't clear, continuing through the process to, in the proactive sidewalk, make sure we were taking the steps in order to get the sidewalks cleared. So I just want to say thanks to a couple people here real quick. In addition to the many different folks who went out in the field, most recently Elisha Lingett and Megan Conley have really been helping pull together the data and pare down that and look for information that we can find in there from our 2018-19 sidewalk process. So I'm going to walk through the proactive sidewalk piece. So the pie charts that you see in front of you represent all of the data that we collected from the 7 different inspections that we completed this year. Like I said earlier, we inspected over 35,000 properties. Prior to us getting out there and doing the inspection, 96% were cleared. And that takes you to the green and the red. The red represents a little over 1,300 properties that were in violation 4%. Through the process, we then send out notice of violations, and what you can see is about 58% of people, once they get their notice of violations, clear their sidewalk. The remaining 42% did not. I also want to just be really clear in this process. So in the proactive, according to the ordinance, there's 2 different timelines. Residential properties have 24 hours. All other properties have 4 hours. We did not create a proactive sidewalk approach to look at the 4-hour. We just did the 24 hours with this year's pilot.
Councilmember Fletcher?
Thank you, Chair. So I've gotten some feedback when comments were made that sort of reported on data like this, really skeptical about it. And so I guess I'm wondering if you can talk a little more about what compliant means, and if you have any theories about why I think public perception generally, certainly the feedback I've gotten from my constituents, doesn't align with the notion that there was 96% compliance. That number sounds kind of outrageous to me, just based on my experience walking around neighborhoods in my ward, and so I'm sort of curious about how to interpret this.
So there's a couple questions there. I'm going to start answering them, Mr. Chair and Councilmember Fletcher, and if I miss one, feel free to remind me. So a little bit about what compliance meant is we trained our staff to go out and look at sidewalks and have a passable surface, which I do believe is sometimes different than what other people's expectations are. And I also want to just say that well, this is not every property with every event. The 35,000 is a total over 7 events. I'm going to get into a little bit more detail event by event, but I do think that there is sometimes a difference in expectation and understanding, and I will really point that out, especially as the season went on this year, with the rain and the freezing and one's ability to even clear the sidewalk as things thaw, water's running downhill. What do you do? How do we keep that passable? So,
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Fletcher, I might also add that we had a similar reaction when we first saw this data. And as we picked it apart, it became more reasonable. The way that I have thought about it is that it only takes one non-compliant property to ruin the whole block. And so you will have a perception of unpassable blocks that might be a result of a property that hasn't cleared, who is in violation.
So just moving on to share the compliance.
Quickly, Councilmember Gordon.
we do any tracking of how many pedestrian pathways were permanently obstructed because of that one property owner along that path? I mean, that might be something that would be interesting to assess, is how much of our winter walkways are obstructed and we can't be used by somebody in a wheelchair. Just even if it is just a few properties, that still might mean that we actually have a majority or 40% or 10% or only 1% of access to a bus stop blocked or something like that.
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Gordon, it's a great question. Lisa and I talked about this about 30 minutes ago as we were preparing for this presentation, and I think that at the end of the presentation we were going to tell you about some next steps, and one of them is what do we do with repeat offenders. So we're already starting to think about what happens now that we can see who over and over. Now what is one of our next discussions, next steps.
Thank you.
So this next set of pie charts really shows the compliance quadrant by quadrant, and this is exactly as Director Hutchinson mentioned, is even when one property is not clear on a block, it does make that entire block impassable. And so I guess what I want to say is we recognize there's still work to be done, which is why later on in the presentation you'll see we have next steps. So I'm going to show, the next several slides are going to show basically the results quadrant or grid by grid within each quadrant, our tracking methodology, and the data. And there is more detail that we are continuing to work through and digging into, and will continue to help us inform and adapt through upcoming seasons. So just to help with what you're going to be seeing, each of these graphs represent the results by grid. For example, the very first one is a grid up in the northwest quadrant of Minneapolis. There were 601 properties inspected, 502 were compliant, and 99 violations. What's interesting is this snow event was about 2 inches of snow accumulation. It was the first snow event of the season. It was the lowest average compliance rate of 89% that we saw. We attribute that to a lot of people forgetting their shovels or not getting them out in a timely manner, snow blowers not starting, just kind of forgetting about the whole winter routine. The next inspection was, again, just over 2 inches of snow, and we did see an increased compliance later on in the month, or in early December. Later on, in December, again, we kind of saw just a slight uptick to 97%. One of the things that I found interesting when you look at this quadrant by quadrant, it really was grid driven, not quadrant driven, where the highest rate of compliance was. In January, our events started getting larger, and this one was an event greater than 5 inches. When there were 5 inches of snow, it did, in some places, in some ways, we heard, create challenges between plowing and sidewalk shoveling, especially in areas where there is not a boulevard, and that space has to be shared.
Councilmember Palmisano?
Thank you, Chair. Ms. Stroni, what do you mean when you said compliance seemed to be more grid-driven? What do you mean by that?
Let me go back to here. So the map in the bottom right, the little gray boxes are grid, and the darker black, purple lines are the quadrants. And so what we found interesting is maybe all of the grids that we inspected in, for example, quadrant A, sometimes we had low compliance, sometimes we had high compliance. So we didn't see any consistency, I guess I'll say, in compliance. It was very small grid driven compliance rather than larger quadrant. So in February, we were surprised to see that the compliance was actually at its highest in 98%. That was around the time when we had the polar vortex, so the temperatures were dropping, snow was increasing. We had about 11 inches of accumulation over multiple days when we went out on our February 14th inspection. One of the other things that you'll see later in the presentation is that as the winter went on, and February was a very difficult month for many people from a snow perspective, that the calls for assistance to 311 increased. But we still did have around 96% compliance. And the last inspection was around 90%, and again, just over 5 inches heavy, wet snow.
Councilmember Johnson?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Was there any distinction in this data between corners and kind of the interior blocks? Because, from my experience at least, it seemed like the corners were in just really terrible shape on a lot of blocks, and oftentimes it would be down to kind of like the mashed snow from footsteps that was just about yay wide that you could kind of get through if you're able-bodied. But it seemed like that was also, interestingly enough, a frustration I heard from folks living on corners, as they felt like the plows would keep coming along and filling it in with snow, and so they'd have to keep going and shoveling, and especially after deep freezes, when that would happen, then it would become almost impossible to clear. And so there just seemed to be really poor compliance on corners, at least from my experience. So did you have data on that?
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Johnson, one of the, when we were looking at the work order information related to the proactive work, we did make the observation that more corner lots were cleared by the contractor than other lots. And to your point, it might be that it is a little more difficult, it is more challenging, they have more feet of sidewalk. Right now, I don't have a whole lot more information on that, other than our numbers maybe align with what you observed.
Yeah, and I think when I say corner lots too, it's less the actual linear sidewalk that runs along the property, but more the curb cuts for pedestrians to actually cross the street seem to be where there were really issues there, which seems to me like a really critical component, right?
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Johnson, you're absolutely correct. Let's just say the entire length of the block is cleared, but you get to the end of the block and you can't get over that pile of snow. It still makes that block impassable. And so it was a challenging winter for us as well from a roadway plowing perspective and a partnership with the residents of Minneapolis. What you don't see is there were many times that we didn't go out after a snow event because there wasn't a 24-hour break in snow. And we were continuing to plow and we were continuing to be out there, but it does build up on those corners. So as I already mentioned, during the season, there were 4 grids that were randomly selected twice, which was very helpful. We're still really digging into this. What we did observe is that the second time we inspected the grid, it either stayed the same or increased, or on average increased, whichever way you want to look at that, to a fairly high percent. Now, there were obviously still some properties that were not compliant during that second inspection. And what we found interesting is only 4 of those repeat inspections were repeat non-compliance. So it shifted. And so we're not sure why or how or where, but that's where we need to continue to dig in to see what that means and what we can do. And are there other ways? Was it just somebody was gone? There's a whole variety of different things, but that's one of the benefits of having a grid and getting there more than once is being able to really dig into that data. So as I move into the next steps, I want to just come back to the high-level results. So overall, the numbers showed that in the grids that we inspected, and again, I want to be really clear, that was the grids we were inspected, not citywide, we observed 96% compliance. When we sent out the notice of violation, that prior to the contractor going out there, that number increased to 98%, which means 2% of the properties that we inspected were cleared by the contractor and invoiced for that work. So with this information, our plan for 2019, the 2019 winter season, is to double the number of grids and really continue to gather data to inform continually adapting our process, continually looking for opportunities. And in order to do this, we plan to reprioritize, just like we did this year, the inspection and the remainder of the process, the notice of violation. We anticipate those numbers will go up just simply because we're inspecting more properties. We're making more connections with residents and business owners. And we also are going to need to likely increase the capacity for a contractor that is going to clear the sidewalks because, again, making the assumptions that we saw today, we're going to have more properties that need to be cleared. And again, our goal is to get properties cleared as quickly as possible to make the city passable. I've already started having conversations with NCR and 311 because we still really feel like there are a number of property owners that do not have the capacity to clear their sidewalks. And we need to build that resource up, and we need to do that in advance of the winter season so that those resources are ready to hit the ground running come the first snow event. We feel that's very, very important to, again, make sure that there are resources available. Along with that, we need to improve the data collection along the way. One of the things that we found out as we observed, the city received 466 calls for snow removal help. And you can see kind of how that was distributed throughout the year. And you can see we really hit a peak in February when we had 9 different snow events. But what we don't have is where those people are calling from. So one of the challenges is many of the resources that are willing to help people clear sidewalks are focus on certain parts of the city in close proximity to where those organizations are. We don't know if we have the organizations lined up in the right place. And so we also need to collect better data from where people are needing help in order to build that capacity in the right location.
Councilmember Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I happen to have a lot of seniors in my ward, and so I was actually surprised how little we heard about the pretty quick reaching of capacity for a lot of these services. And I think sometimes it's not necessarily a popular message when people call, but to say, look, these resources are really a last resort. I mean, hopefully they're talking to family, they're talking to friends, they're talking to neighbors, they're, if they have the capacity to pay for service. And we had those conversations in the office. I remember one of them, for instance, where he said, the gentleman called and said he wasn't physically able to clear his sidewalk. And so I said, well, do you have any family that can help? And he said, no, I don't have any family. I said, well, what about any friends? He says, I don't have any friends. I said, what about neighbors? He said, all my neighbors hate me. And so I said, so you're telling me you're not able to pay for having the sidewalk cleared? He said, well, I actually could pay. I just haven't gotten around to that yet. And so, you know, I think sometimes that's a difficult message to convey, but when people's first reaction is, I want to call the city and have somebody just take care of this for me, it displaces those out there that really don't have the resources, don't have the social network and the support. And so hopefully we can continue to carry that message across about community building and helping your neighbors out and such, so that that's, the first place people turn. And then the last place is organizations that can help when they really, really don't have access to those resources.
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Johnson, that's exactly why we need to partner with NCR to help us and 311, so that we are all very clear in our communication, and we're, again, just really building that resource for folks that really need it.
Councilmember Gordon.
So I wonder if there isn't more that we could do to facilitate it with some of these property owners. As you know, I've maybe been more interested in seeing if we could have more involvement in keeping our sidewalks clean, more involvement as a city than some who are involved in the enterprise here. But just through some observations and thought this past winter, and also with all of this information, it seems like there might be a particularly small number of households that are particularly challenged with clearing their sidewalks. And there might be a limited role or a limited pilot that we can be involved in, and some of it might be by working with some of our present contractors and matching them up with some of those households, and some that maybe could even pay for those services. I think one of the things that we maybe did with our inspections this winter was people looked at their budgets and said, I'm just going to go ahead and hire somebody to do mine this winter and keep it clear because I can afford it. Other people might have a harder time getting that money set aside and doing that. Then there might be a role where we could somehow facilitate or even share property tax dollars or use a utility bill, but even help people cover the costs of that. And I think there might be people who would opt into that service, more people than we might imagine, and they'd say, sure, put it on my utility bill, I'm going to get that service, and then we don't even necessarily have to send out our folks to do the shoveling because we have some contractors. So we could experiment and look at that and even try it in a portion of the city. And we might find that it's at 2% or whatever, those corner lots, it's not as big a problem. I also think if that were successful, we could maybe get to the point where we'd say, once we have a contractor go out 2 times, we're going to require you to join this program or take advantage of this service or whatever it is. That's a far cry from what they do in Bloomington, I just want you to know, but it's a little bit of a step towards taking some more responsibilities and make sure that everybody can get around in our challenging winter. So that's just an idea that I want to put out there to think about. And even if it's a limited area, maybe we could find a place where there aren't volunteer groups. I do know that we referred people to some groups who didn't really have the capacity to necessarily match them up with a bunch of shovelers. They're volunteer groups and they want to help. There's healthy seniors groups in Ward 2 that do a lot of work, and they'll try to find somebody who might shovel at a rate. But I don't know. So that's it's a thought. Mike Chair, and this has really been valuable for us to look at it, I guess, and get more information, and appreciate any response you have to that or not.
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Gordon, I'll provide a brief response, but will obviously be available to continue to talk with any council member on this topic. We have been thinking of ways we could be doing more and where we would prioritize those resources. And it keeps coming back to the corners. It keeps coming back to the corners as being probably the toughest issue to solve to keep things passable. So while there are a whole list of really great ideas out there, if we have to pick one, we're going to pick many of them, but those that may involve additional resources, we want to start with the area that we think will make the most difference. And right now, our current line of thinking is that corners need our help. Everybody, I think, out there is feeling like the corners need the help. I do completely agree that we need to try and expand the resources for those that need assistance shoveling. We were taken by surprise by how quickly things were full. And quite honestly, I think they had been full from last year, and we just didn't understand the limited nature of the resources. So we've got a major effort going on with that as well, because there simply needs to be more resources out there for people who need help.
Councilmember Palmisano?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Your conclusions might suggest that we do more proactive inspections, or you're nodding your head yes. I'm less sure of that. I think that what we've seen in compliance rate, I guess I'll ask, has it been mapped to when we've had 311 calls on a property? Like if we've issued a notice to a property and they've remediated it, do we find that they don't come into violation again more likely? So that could be done through the app, through 311, online, by members of the general public as well, right?
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Palmisano, I just want to make sure I'm understanding what you're saying before I answer your question. I think if I understood what you're saying is, do we have information in our data that shows where we have properties that are not in compliance, and does that, are they regular offenders maybe, or places where we don't have compliance, and so is there something else we should be doing?
I guess what I'm saying is it's clear through some of this and even in our own experiences up here that there are repeat violators, and that's not going to get better no matter how many letters we send. And then there are kind of that, it looked like about half of them then came into compliance, right? And then maybe didn't violate again.
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Palmisano, we only have 4 quadrants and a small subset of properties that we can analyze that. One of the things we found interesting is there were only 4 that were repeat offenders, but we still had more than that were in violation the second time. And so that's partially why we feel adding addition or doubling, I guess I'll say, our proactive sidewalk work next year to help us continue to get that data to, maybe I'll say, try to pinpoint those that are regularly repeating violations, and just to know that the conversation has gone, well, snow and ice is in the winter. Are there other violations that might be comparable in other seasons that might not be public works responsibility, like lack of mowing or things like that? And are those properties matching up all year? And should we take a broader city approach on those types of things? I don't think we have enough data yet to get there, and we're continuing to work on our partnerships with other departments to get that information to inform a possibly different process.
Mr. Chair and Councilmember Palmisano, I would add to that the reason we started doing the proactive inspection is because we wanted to improve accuracy. And I am really happy to have the 311 data that we do now, because we can work better together on improving that accuracy. And one of the ways to improve accuracy is to visually inspect. So I think this is improving our processes. When we have an inaccurate notice of violation, we're actually just making a new problem. We're not solving the problem on the ground. We got to backtrack. There's a stack of envelopes that we got to work through. So we're trying to eliminate that step by visually inspecting. So that's just a little bit of background on why we even started, and one of the reasons we think that expansion of it would be helpful for the city.
Thank you. I appreciate that. When we are able to show that we have 96% compliance rate, it makes me feel that maybe proactive inspections didn't have the impact that we all thought it would up here, because we're using a lot of resources to get 96% compliance rate. Something that we spoke about yesterday in the audit committee, and I know this isn't the bulk of your presentation, but it is how you set up the conversation, was about the discrepancy in data when a member of the public or when a caller calls 311 to report a violation from where they're at, but especially the mobile app, the See Click Fix app, if you have not been on it lately, feels kind of outdated. And in fact, in yesterday's audit committee, we found that there were GIS errors in there, and that must also impact all kinds of things that go beyond snow and ice clearing, but things like mowing, potholes, other kinds of remediation efforts. We talk about collecting better data. I think that maybe if we were investing more in the 311 and the mobile app and how the public can report something that gets specific enough to get an accurate address out of it, we could do a lot better with how we're all managing one another on this social contract of keeping our sidewalks clear. So I guess I'm curious, could you help us? Do you think it's appropriate to lead a cross-functional work group? Because this is an enterprise issue. It goes beyond public works. It goes into regulatory services stuff. I think it would make sense to lead a work group to discuss those issues of geographic information data quality between databases and GIS systems, and maybe help us come back with some kind of a solution. And I appreciate that it goes beyond public works, but I think it might be the most useful to public works, and it might help address some of this work. Is that something that you find appropriate at this time?
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Palmisano, further discussion is most definitely appropriate. I would look first to IT. The depth of the problem lies somewhere in an IT system that we may not fully understand, but I would be fully in support of participating in such a work group. I think that the data issues were something that we were feeling, but didn't have any way to say we think this is happening. And so I think we are all of us involved in this really grateful to have the review and the information, because information is power. And now we can do something about it. And I think we would be very happy to participate in that. Mm-hmm.
Councilmember Johnson, followed by Councilmember Fletcher.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First, I want to say thank you so much for this effort. I think it's been highly valued by residents. I've talked to so many people who are really grateful that this was happening this year. I also want to call out the impressive outreach. I've not seen as much media coverage around any other issue as I can think of as I have seen with this. I actually think that would probably have a positive influence effect on the overall rate of clearing. But I'll disagree with my colleague on the 96% piece, because I appreciate what you said. Well, 96% sounds impressive as a number. If it's equally distributed across the city, that would mean basically every single block would be impassable in our city. I also really appreciate Councilmember Fletcher's point about his experience and what he heard from constituents as well, because I agree with that too. I share that skepticism around these numbers. I remember when this first was starting up, and I got pretty eager about it because in the past it seemed like it was pointless to call 311 because there were so many violations. So while I was out on a walk earlier this winter, I called 311 and I started reporting the addresses and that I saw where people had not shoveled, and literally I could not report them fast enough to 311, and so I was trying to type down the addresses as I was walking by them while talking to the agent, and finally my hands got cold enough that I gave up. And by my experience, probably a typical block had at least 2 to 3 violations. Some blocks would have 5 to 7 violations, and so it seemed pretty excessive. I would say if we can have 311 add to the app the functionality of being able to report sidewalk violations and be able to take a picture and report them, I think that would be huge, because that's actually the reason why I called 311, is because you could not do that through the app, which seemed like a pretty big missed opportunity from an operational standpoint. I'm really excited that your proposal is to double the number of inspections. I would actually be interested in knowing how much, from a budgetary standpoint, it would take to get to citywide, and even potentially being able to inspect citywide after every large event. I think it would be helpful to have that context of how much we could roll this out. And then to Councilmember Palmisano's point, I think over time, over multiple years of doing this, to be able to track, understand those chronic offenders, and maybe at some point we can actually reduce the amount of proactive inspection, but I think we, from this point forward, at least for the foreseeable future, should be ramping this up and then using data to really guide the decision-making process around that. And also to Councilmember Gordon's point, assuming that it's not equally distributed, these violations, what % of sidewalks are we really finding that are impassable, and especially when you include corners as well in that equation? Finally, I'm curious, how do we move forward these next steps? What are the budgetary impacts? Do you need a staff direction from us? I see that we just have receive and file on this, but I know last year we were able to get some budgetary resources for this. Is there a greater need for that? And then is there an engagement as well with partners like housing inspections and such to help with this effort?
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Johnson, questions about resources, 3 categories. First category is what can we do with the resources we have, and that is increase inspections. And that's a result of last year's budget when we were successful in adding a position for inspections, right-of-way inspections, so that really helped. We are, as you know, midstream on this year's budget discussions and proposals, and we're looking forward to having those discussions with you in the future. And then the third category is how do we rely on and leverage all of the departmental partnerships that we have, and that's something that Lisa's been working on, reaching out to Kim Keller first to see if there's ways that we can do this together and do it better.
Great, thank you. Well, I really appreciate all the work on this. And again, think about the human side of things beyond this. I mean, my wife would, when she worked for HCMC, and she oversaw clinics essentially at HCMC, they would have a daily conference call in the winter where each clinic would talk about in the morning any sort of issues that were happening. And she told me about how literally every single day, some clinic would have a staff member out due to an injury from slipping and falling on sidewalks. And so there's a real human cost to this, and I just so greatly appreciate all the work, because we just got to think about all the individuals that have been injured in our city or worse as a result of this, and all the folks as well that are stuck inside their homes during winter and can't get out or can't safely navigate or get to the store. So it has a huge impact on quality of life for a city that essentially half the year has snow or cold weather. So it's really important and a big priority, and I can't thank you enough for your efforts on this.
Thank you. Councilmember Fletcher.
Thank you, Chair. I want to just add to this conversation, and besides sort of echoing Councilmember Gordon's push to keep thinking creatively about this and keep thinking about how to bring more resources to this. I want to add one area where I know for a fact there was not 96% compliance, which is construction sites. And I'm going to draw another division of Public Works, I think, into the conversation. In places where we require alternative sidewalks to be provided with Jersey barriers going around temporary obstructions, the space between Jersey barriers was a snow catch basin, and they were not passable fairly consistently across neighborhoods, across construction companies. I would say that's just something that it's clear that we don't enforce, and that those temporary sidewalks become impassable. So I don't know if there are steps that we can take to change the expectations with people who are applying for obstruction permits, but that's definitely an area where in downtown and in Northeast, many of the blocks that became impassable, that was why they became impassable.
Thank you. Councilmember Palmisano.
Thank you. Going back to what my colleague, Councilmember Johnson, said, one of the ways that I think that we can invest in better accuracy is that the 311 contract is up with the mobile application this year. So I think it's really timely that we figure out what would be needed to improve other people's reporting of this. And then beyond that, it will make sense to be able to identify, and I think we can you have broad agreement up here that construction sites are some of the worst in terms of being able to clear snow and ice. And maybe we need a different way to get enforcement on that and to manage that, and that might include code construction services personnel, as I've done some effort on that in the past with 1 to 4 unit construction sites. But I think, so what I've sent to my colleagues is a proposed staff direction to consider as one action item out of here, and it really does come as a result of the audit work that was recently done and your answers here of participating, maybe not leading, but participating in a cross-functional work group. I think that cross-functional work group would also appropriately, so I would bring a similar staff direction to our enterprise committee, because that would be where we would give direction to IT, 311, and reg services. Well, IT and 311 anyway. So I suggest that we ask Public Works to participate in a cross-functional work group to discuss issues with geographic information data quality between various databases used across the city and identify solutions that will increase data quality in an actionable way within Public Works efforts, and to report back to us by November. That I get that that's somewhat dependent on who's leading this work group. But I do think it's important. I think that, as Councilmember Johnson mentioned, we should be really deliberate about what we're asking for instead of just small resources. What we're starting to see is that something like this is maybe the tip of the iceberg, but there's a lot more underneath that could really get at the root of the problem or enable the public to help manage each other better in a way that isn't about adding more city resources to things like inspections. So I would ask my colleagues to consider that, and if it's appropriate, I'd like to move that as a motion.
That's moved as a motion, and we'll make that as an amendment to the receive and file that would be before us at the conclusion of this report. If the colleagues are in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Okay, that is now an amendment to the receive and file. Anything further on the report?
That pretty much sums up what I had to share today.
Well, I have to thank my colleagues for reinforcing once again in a very meaningful and contextual way how important this is to the city. I mean, this is a fundamental aspect of one of our core policies, which is complete streets. And when you don't have a clear sidewalk, you don't have a complete street, period. And as Council Member Johnson poignantly stated, there's a human side to this that is so apparent. And therefore, I think, even though we now are looking at this very clear-eyed, I think this whole approach has allowed a more data-driven approach, a very sort of open-eyed, honest assessment of the challenges. But even knowing these challenges, it does not abate our sincerity of wanting to approach this and get better results. And so I think there's a strong commitment for that. And I appreciate the staff direction to say that we have to have certainly a multi-department, maybe even a multi-jurisdictional approach to this as we try to get deeper into that which will get those results. So I will move the receive and file as amended with the staff direction from Councilmember Palmisano and agreed upon by the council or this committee. All in favor say aye. Aye. Dissenting nay. That carries, and thank you. We are adjourned.